everything was ready. After the Council of Clermont, the voice of the people and the voice of the clergy made the decision. Recruitment was had, the United Christian Forces, joined by the army of Godfrey, the army of Hugh the Great, the army of Robert Carthose, and the army of Bohemond, went and continued, win after win, after the siege of Nicaea, the battle of Dorylaeum, the siege of Antioch. Eventually they were able to reach Jerusalem. Today, the 7th of June 1099, marks the date, the first day of the siege of Jerusalem, the last destination and the main objective of the first Christian crusade to retake the Holy Land away from the Muslims. We will see eventually in a few days, perhaps a few months, whether or not the siege was successful, but for now we are moving away from sieges and instead we are talking about raids, because we have to go back to our final thoughts in Castle Nathria. Yesterday we did the cool thing. Yesterday we talked about the death rankings of all specs in Castle Nathria, just how much they died in each and every boss. Now instead we go and take a look at how this tier has been when it comes to the participation of the guilds, when it comes to the strength, I guess the performance of the specs, and a few other interesting things that is worth pointing out before we move over eventually in the next tier. Soon, I hope. Now the first thing worth pointing out is the participation. We have gone a little over 6 months into this raid tier and the amount of kills of the Nathrius are around 1700. When you compare this to Gahun in Uldir, the number was about 1800 and for Jaina was also around 1900. So the numbers are very similar. The Gahun number is a little bit skewed and unfair because Uldir didn't last 6 months. Many of these kills are going to be guilds in BOD, in Battle of the Zralor gear, going back into Uldir. So that's a little bit unfair, but the number of kills stays similar to what we had to the previous expansion, at least in the first few tiers. Just as a reminder, just as a comparison, we can see how the last tier of BFA ended when it came to the performance of the DPS specs compared to how this tier is ending with the performance of the DPS specs. Unfortunately, Fire Mage and Shadow Priest are still there as the most and best performing specs. You have the upside down of Elemental Shaman, who ended up Nyalotha badly, but this tier they did the opposite. They had a pretty good rise overall. In Castle Nathria, you happen to have some pretty evenly split specs between Warlocks. You have Affliction very high, you have Demonology as a middle of the pack spec, and Destruction as a more underperforming one, whereas by the end of Nyalotha it was kind of the opposite. It was Affliction lagging behind both Destruction and Demonology, particularly Destruction. Despite the sadness of looking at marksmanship right now in Castle Nathria compared to what it was at the start, they were still outperforming Beast Mastery, which was the opposite of what we saw in Nyalotha at the end. And many other specs have traditionally remained in the middle of the pack. Enhancement, despite the rework, is still in the middle. So does Frost Decay. Main difference, but not too surprising, was Arms Warrior getting kind of out of control with corruptions by the end of Nyalotha over Fury, whereas now we have the opposite. We have Fury outperforming Arms by quite a bit. But that was the last tier. That was in BFA. Let's just move over to Castle Nathria now, pure and proper. So one thing I wanted to look at immediately was some of the changes that Blizzard decided to put in this tier, in this Castle Nathria raid, after they looked at all the performance of the specs. Look at this nice little graph. This is two little brothers holding hands in their respective performance. These are Marksmanship Hunter and Elemental Shaman. This is in 9.0, before 9.0.5 balance comes in, and this is after. So the poor Hunter, we can see it in graph form. They're getting outperformed, and the rise of Elemental Shaman getting more and more prominent in 9.0.5. And then there is another one, which we're leaving out when it comes to great rises, which is this one right here, which is Assassination Rogue, which also has received a series of buffs which have brought them to be performing very well in Castle Nathria. However, yes, Elemental has performed well, Assassination has performed well. However, we have to talk about the top 4 before we go any further. If we have to take a recap of this raid tier, we have to look at this. This starts basically on March the 10th, so almost 3 months ago. This is for basically the entirety of 9.0.5, this last part of the tier. And you can see that we have the outliers at the top. You have Balance, you have Affliction, you have Shadow Priest, and you have Fire Mage. Yes, technically Fire Mage is the one that around a month and a half ago stopped growing exponentially as much as the other three. Now, it is also worth mentioning that all of these other three specs, together with Fire Mage, are all getting nerfed in 9.1. So this helps us visualize the power of the specs at the end of this tier compared to the specs that are planned on being nerfed or planned on being buffed in 9.1. All the four at the top over there are going to get nerfed in 9.1. Now, despite some people might be salty and just not like it, but I do think there is a pretty healthy middle of the pack there. Look how relatively close those lines all are over the course of several months. I think that's pretty healthy and good. It's the type of closeness that means maybe one of them is better in single target, maybe one of them is better in AoE, maybe this one is better in cleave, etc, etc. So I think it's good. Yeah, there is a middle of the pack, and then there is four that don't really belong there. The four in question are Subtlety Rogue, Arms Warrior, Survival Hunter, and Beast Mastery Hunter. Well, Beast Mastery and Survival are getting buffed, so possibly there is going to be a rise. Arms is also getting buffed to offset the fact that Blizzard basically overbuffed Fury and left Arms a little bit behind. The only one not really receiving anything, unfortunately for now, is Subtlety Rogue. We have been a few weeks now, I think 3 weeks, without balance tuning, significant balance tuning in the PTR, and still nothing about Subtlety Rogue, so it's not looking too good right now, because all the other specs in the middle of the pack means they are at a level where an extra conduit, a powerful soulbind, a good new legendary can give them some better scaling, some better synergy with their abilities that can make them become not flavor of the month, not over time the most popular spec, but a contender for a spot, you know, a very good and solid spec, which is not going to be stuck three of them level of goodness, but certainly fine, certainly something you might want in a raid with no problem at all. Now, we have to talk about another unfortunate problem though, going away for a second from the DPS, and we have to talk about healers. This is what I'm showing you. No, this is not the healing done by the specs, this is the DPS. So the problem I have isn't just this one. Yes, this one shows you that the three specs that do damage for their healing have more damage done than the specs that don't. That's pretty logical. Paladin is the one that uses it the most. Then there is Discipline Priest, and then lower down there is the sad attempt of reviving Fist Weaving by Blizzard, which clearly isn't doing nearly as much damage as needed. The real problem is that not only this is the damage gap, but you see, this is the kind of problem you have. Over time, it gets even worse. This is after 9.0.5. This is growing. You know, Paladins went from having 1600 DPS to the other healers 500 to having 2300 DPS to the other healers still 500. The problem is when you scale your gear and your stats and your entire toolkit is around doing damage, you're just going to be doing more damage. But if you're a Resto Shaman or a Resto Druid or Holy Priest and you're not doing damage, it's not that getting more gear and getting more secondary stats is going to give you more damage because you're not clicking the damage buttons to begin with. So just to point out the problem, in 9.1, Holy Paladin is scheduled to be nerfed roughly 18% in their damage done. This 18% won't even cover the DPS growth that Holy Paladin had in 9.0.5 compared to the other healers. And as soon as the tier starts, they will start gaining 10, 20, and 30 more item levels, which is going to further spike up their damage done. So effectively, the damage nerf to Holy Paladin is a band-aid. It's the reason why not many people, barely anyone, believes that Paladins being nerfed in damage is going to do anything to the current situation in the meta of healers. And I think showing it in graph form displays it pretty well. We could also show just for free the healers' HPS, but I mean, HPS doesn't really matter too much for healers. As a matter of fact, look there. Look there how great Mistweaver Monk is, right? It's got high HPS. Yeah. Now to finish the spec-based talks before we go into the actual raid, I wanted to step for a second in the mage's shoes. This has been the progression of damage for the 3 mage specs. The top one is, of course, Fire Mage, the middle one is Arcane, and the one at the bottom is Frost. There is going to be some growth for both Frost and Arcane in 9.1 as they are getting buffed, and also Fire Mage is, of course, getting nerfed. The magnitude of the nerfs to Fire Mage are actually significant compared to the ones we just mentioned for Holy, so that is why there is a possibility that perhaps Fire Mage is going to lose in value a little bit in 9.1 and be overtaken by the other mage specs. What, on the other end, seems a little bit worrying is Warlock, because this is the 9.0.5 for Warlock, and unlike mages, Affliction is just growing. Affliction is not plateauing at a certain DPS, it's not stalling, and what is more problematic is that Destruction and Demonology aren't growing at the same rate. There are going to be some nerfs to Affliction, which are more of a damage redistribution, dots hitting harder in the exchange of Malefic Rapture being weaker. We will have to see how impactful that is going to be. What we are missing though is more significant, more meaty buffs for Destruction and for Demonology, because they haven't received enough of them, or at least of a big enough magnitude to make a dent in the disparity between them and Affliction. Now, after going to the specs, the singular specs, the whole groups, the tanks and healers, and the DPS, not much to see for tanks really, but what I wanted to look at was the bosses, compared to what we have seen normally from previous expansions. I think the big black spot on this raid is going to be Stone Legion Generals going further, because many people have voiced their displeasure at the way the fight worked, the way the mechanics worked. Way too many mechanics crammed into a single fight, which was also too long, so it became even more frustrating having to go through it. Even now that has been nerfed multiple times in multiple mechanics, it's still found to be very frustrating by players. I think that was a botched attempt by Blizzard. Maybe they wanted to overcompensate for the oversimplified Sludge Fist fight. They're like, okay, we're going to save the mechanics from Sludge Fist and just dump them all into Stone Legion. I think one of the important things when you want to look at a raid as a whole, if you're a DPS and you hope you can be useful, you hope your damage profile can be strong in the raid, is for the later bosses to be varied enough, or to have different phases within the same boss that reward different damage profile. Let's just forget the first bosses, okay? Because Shriekwing, yes, it's pure single target. And Zymox, yes, it's pure single target. And Hungering Destroyer, yes, it's pure single target. Wow, it's a raid for pure single target. No, those are early bosses, nobody cares. You have to go deeper down. You have to look at Council of Blood, you have to look at Sludge Fist, at Stone Legion Generals, and at Denatrius. So yes, okay, Sludge Fist is pure single target, but the strongest part and the most important part of the encounter is the charge. So the Hateful Gaze and getting double damage taken means burst. Single target damage is the most important damage profile in the entire fight. Then you have Council of Blood. Council of Blood has the focusing on the attendant, so you get rewards for having single target burst. You have the spread AoE and dots and multi-dots and cleaving and whatnot for the adds spread all around. And technically, if you can gain resources from, multi-dotting the bosses, that's also good. So that is also a different type of damage being rewarded. And then you have the consistent single target being rewarded for, of course, damaging the boss itself. So it is a pretty good fight when it comes to spreading damage. Everyone can find its own niche there. If you have burst, you can be fine dealing damage to the attendant. If you have consistent single target with some funnel, you can be fine tunneling the boss. If you have spread cleave like a balanced druid or an affliction warlock with never-ending corruptions, you can just do your job for adds. So that's a nice fight that can encompass everyone. Stone Legion is also very similar. At nearly any given time, you will be able to gain some benefit from cleaving, some benefit from AoEing. The burst damage is also gaining power and value because there are plenty of adds you can focus on, to burst down, so it's another comprehensive fight. Same can be said for the Nathrius. Let's completely discard phase 1 because it doesn't matter. In phase 2 and phase 3, it's mostly single target, it's mostly burst. So the different types of profiles of fights are very good because they can make multiple specs viable and give them, a reason to be in the raid because you want them for a very particular damage phase, a very particular scenario, and it can help a lot. I do think they did a pretty good job this tier compared to Nyalotha. I think Nyalotha was much worse when it came to what you needed from the players. There was a lot of this ad is spawning and you absolutely must kill it very, very quickly type of deal, which gave a lot of value to burst damage, as well as lots of consistent AoE and cleaving and multi-dotting. You had, plenty of situations with this, whereas in Castle Nathria you had more windows for more diverse types of damage, which made more specs feel more useful compared to what we had before. I also do appreciate the healing profile. This is something maybe DPS players, so the majority of players will not take too much care for, but the healing profile has also slightly changed. Not enough, unfortunately. This was my prediction before the expansion. Not enough, unfortunately, to make throughput specs more popular. So the prediction was we were getting less huge damage windows, so less huge damage taken that required a big cooldown. So the need for damage reduction was reduced and the need of high throughput for consistent damage was becoming more necessary. You could see kind of that fights like Hungering Destroyer, fights like Inerva, fights like Zymox, even fights like Stone Legion don't really have some crucial big damage reduction phase, but more so very consistent damage that you want to continuously heal. So Restoration Druid, Holy Priest, Mistweaver Monk, and their very high throughput HPS could have been better than a Shaman or a Discipline Priest with lower healing but stronger externals, stronger cooldowns. It didn't quite turn out to be that way. Turns out that, of course, Sludge Fist for the charges, that was invaluable. On Stone Legion also, it wasn't even the damage itself, but it was the healing reduction. Being able to put people into Spirit Link or cheat the healing reduction with Absorbs, that also made it much more important. And then the Nathrius itself, all of the blood prices being very, very dangerous and requiring some powerful damage reduction externals. But I still think it was better than Nyalotha. In Nyalotha, it was basically mandatory for basically every boss to have a neat and tidy cycle of external cooldowns, whereas now it is not as important because, as I mentioned, outside of those very clear phases, it's more free-for-all. It is less precise in the amount of cooldowns where and how you want them. There are only a very few select bosses where you want to have this type of super clean order, like Council of Blood, for example. Many other fights now are more sort of free for you to use your CDs compared to Nyalotha, so I also think that was good. I do agree in the end, to close this video and talk about difficulty, I do agree in the end that the general assessment is that this raid was harder than could or should have been. Without a doubt, it was the hardest first tier raid that I can remember, since the comparisons you would have to make are really badly looking for the competition. Uldir, Emerald, Nightmare, Karazhan, and Gruul's Lair, even Throne of the Four Winds, Highmole, it's not looking good. They are much, much easier compared to Castle Nathria. So we were hit in the first tier of this expansion by a reasonably hard raid tier, and certainly harder than expected for a first tier. Looking at the differences in boss difficulty, I can show you this. This is the kill percentage of the bosses. Basically, how many times are you going to kill the boss for every pull? So, the Nathrius has a 1.7% rate. And then there are bosses, of course, which get a almost 50% rate, like Shriekwing, like Altimore, and then, of course, it goes down. So you can see it's not a perfectly clean and easy spread throughout the bosses. You have the two loot pinatas, which are Shriekwing and Altimore, and then you have the third one, which is generally attempted by pugs. to get their 3 bosses for the Great Vault, which is Hungering Destroyer, and it is still kind of easy. 25% chance to get him down, you're kind of there. After that, you have another easy boss, which has been progressively made easier by the set of nerfs, which is Inerva, as well as together with Sanking Salvation Fight. And then 5 bosses all below 10%, because Denatrius, Stone Legion, Sludge Fist, Council of Blood, and Zymox. Zymox is the surprising one. The seeds mechanics and the overlaps with the portals have proven to be a problem, even for cutting edge guilds that are at a pretty high rank. You can see this in logs very, very often. One shot Shriekwing, one shot Altimore, one shot Hungering Destroyer, one shot Sun Kings, and then like 8 wipes on Zymox. And then one shot Inerva, one shot Council of Blood. You know, it's definitely more complicated in terms of mechanics, which is exactly why the amount of nerfs have not touched Zymox as much as the rest, because the other bosses can be killed faster, you can ignore more mechanics, but you can't ignore the seeds. Doesn't matter if you nerf them, doesn't matter if you nerf the ghosts, there are still going to be overlaps, the seeds are still going to kill you, and you have to do it properly, so it still remains complicated. I think it should have been spread to be a little bit easier for a little bit longer, because if you look at this graph, the first 4 months of the tier between Nyalotha, the last tier of BFA, and Castle Nathria, you can see the difference. In the first 4 months, there were only 4 bosses being killed at a more than a 10% kill rate. Shriekwing, Altimore, Hungering Destroyer, and Sun King Salvation. All the other bosses well below 10%, even well below 5% for 4 of them. Compare this to Nyalotha, and it's a completely different tune. It's in fact the opposite. In the first 4 months, there is actually the opposite, the reverse, when there is only 3 bosses being killed at less than a 10% kill rate, Raden, Carpus, and Nazot itself. So, whereas in Castle Nathria, 6 out of 10 bosses are killed below a 10% kill rate, in Nyalotha it used to be the opposite. 9 out of 12 were killed at above a 10% kill rate, given the same progression time. So since I don't think the general player base has gotten much worse, I think this raid was a little bit overtuned in terms of difficulty. Even with the current nerfs trying to make up for it, maybe Blizzard still had to balance a new world without Titan Forging, a new world without a constantly stacking necklace or a constantly stacking artifact weapon or whatnot that could passively increase your power more and more. So they had to work around. Now the only way to make these bosses easier is with nerfs. You know, these players are not going to get any more power, they're not going to get any more corruptions or Titan Forges. So as soon as they hit their max item level, they are done, and the only way the boss gets easier is if we nerf it. I think that was the adjustment period of the first raid, and I think it's not going to be as rough on the player base in the second tier, because now they have feedback, now they have this on record, how the community progressed in the first tier. So yes, it might have been used as a lab rat, Castle Nathria was, but at least now it's going to be for the betterment of Sanctum of Domination, at least I hope. Now with this overview, an overlook, an overlay, an overpass of the first tier of this expansion, we can call it a day. We can stop, because it's been long enough. We have gone over Castle Nathria enough. We have talked about a few interesting things, a few things to look forward for 9.1, particularly what I just mentioned. I'm going to be pretty interested in seeing how Blizzard is going to spread and level out the difficulty of the bosses. Let me guys know what you thought about this first raid tier. Was it too easy? Was it too hard? How did you find it as a DPS, melee or ranged? How did you find it as a healer, and possibly also as a tank, since we have gotten a few more interesting mechanics in this tier that tanks had to participate in. Now, thank you guys anyways for watching the video. If you enjoyed it, you should subscribe to the channel, and if you don't, well, I'm actually too distracted to even threaten you, because see you guys soon, and in the meantime, it's been the 5th day in a row of continuous lawn mowing starting at 8 in the morning. I am considering going deaf at this point. It would be a preferable solution to this hell.